In December of 1944, somewhere in the frozen forests of Belgium, a young American soldier pressed a headset tighter against his ears and shouted into a radio that barely worked. Artillery thunder shook the ground beneath him, snow packed into every seam of his uniform. The airwaves were filled with static, broken voices, and half-finished transmissions. On the other end of that radio were entire companies of men waiting for orders, artillery support, or confirmation that help was coming. If the signal died, they would be alone. In the Battle of the Bulge, the war was not only fought with rifles and tanks, it was fought through static. By the winter of 1944, many American soldiers believed the war in Europe was nearing its end. Paris had been liberated months earlier. German forces had been pushed back across France, and Allied momentum seemed unstoppable. Units were rotated into the Ardennes forest, a quiet sector considered unsuitable for a major German offensive. The terrain was rough, heavily wooded, and difficult to maneuver. American commanders believed the Germans lacked the strength to launch a large-scale attack through it, especially in winter. That assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. Before dawn on December 16, 1944, the German army launched a massive surprise offensive. Over 200,000 troops, supported by tanks, artillery, and assault guns, smashed into thinly held American lines. Snowstorms and dense fog grounded Allied aircraft and blinded observation posts, roads clogged with refugees, retreating units, and supply trucks. Within hours, American divisions were fractured, units were cut off, and command structures began to unravel. At the center of this chaos were radio operators. In World War II, radio operators were the nervous system of the Army. They carried the responsibility of connecting frontline units to battalion, regiment, division, artillery batteries, and air support. Without radios, commanders were blind. Orders could not move forward, and intelligence could not move back. In the Ardennes, radios became the only lifeline between isolated units and the outside world. Most radio operators were young, often barely out of training. They were taught Morse code, voice procedures, frequency discipline, and equipment maintenance. They trained for combat conditions, but nothing fully prepared them for what the Ardennes would do to radios and the men who carried them. The primary backpack radio used by American infantry units was the SCR-300. It weighed roughly 35 pounds with batteries and antenna. In ideal conditions, it had a range of several miles. In the Ardennes, ideal conditions did not exist. Snow absorbed radio signals. Pine forests interfered with transmission. Hills blocked line of sight. Batteries drained rapidly in sub-zero temperatures. Antennas snapped when brushed against trees or shattered under shell fire. Smaller units relied on SCR-5, 3.6 handy-talkies. These radios had limited range even in good weather. In the Ardennes, they were often reduced to a few hundred yards or less. Static filled the airwaves. Messages broke apart mid-sentence. Operators repeated themselves again and again, hoping fragments of information reached the other end. When the German attack struck, one of its primary objectives was disruption. German artillery targeted command posts and communication hubs. Infiltration units slipped through American lines, cutting wire communications and hunting radio operators. The Germans understood that silencing radios could paralyze entire formations. Radio operators quickly learned that carrying an antenna made them a target. Unlike riflemen who could stay low and concealed, radio operators often had to expose themselves to transmit. Antennas needed height. Operators climbed rubble, trees, or foxhole edges while bullets cracked nearby. Some operators were killed while standing upright in snowfields, holding antennas aloft, trying to punch a signal through the interference. As American lines bent and buckled, radios became the only means of preventing total collapse. Units separated from their headquarters depended on operators to relay enemy movements, request artillery, and coordinate withdrawals or defensive positions. In some cases, radio operators were the only link between surrounded companies and a higher command. The conditions they worked under were brutal. Radios froze, batteries failed without warning. Operators stuffed battery packs inside their jackets to warm them with body heat. Headsets cracked from cold. Fingers went numb, making fine adjustments nearly impossible. Men transmitted while shaking uncontrollably from exposure. Despite the chaos, messages continued to move. A call for artillery here. A warning about an armored column there. A desperate request for ammunition. A confirmation that a road was still open. Each transmission mattered. Each transmission could mean survival or annihilation. As German forces advanced, entire American units were cut off in pockets across the Ardennes. Roads were seized. Towns changed hands repeatedly. Confusion spread as reports conflicted and maps became outdated within hours. Commanders relied on radio operators to piece together a battlefield that no longer made sense. Nowhere was this more critical than around the town of Bastogne. Bastogne sat at a vital road junction. 7 major roads passed through it, making it strategically invaluable. As German forces surged west, Bastogne became a focal point. American units rushed to defend it, many arriving with little rest, limited supplies, and minimal preparation. Radio operators in and around Bastogne worked constantly. Units arrived from different divisions, unfamiliar with one another, operating on different frequencies. Operators struggled to establish contact, coordinate defenses, and keep higher headquarters informed as German forces tightened the noose. Outside Bastogne, other American units were already surrounded. In the northern sector, elements of divisions found themselves isolated, with German forces controlling roads and high ground. For these units, radio contact was often the only proof they still existed. Operators transmitted from cellars, foxholes, barns, and shattered command posts. Some sent messages while shells collapsed buildings around them. Others transmitted from moving vehicles under fire, trying to relay positions before losing contact entirely. As the snow fell heavier and the fog thickened, radios crackled with increasing urgency. Reports spoke of armor breakthroughs, missing units, and towns overrun. Commanders demanded updates that operators struggled to provide. The battlefield was dissolving faster than information could keep up. By the end of the first days of the German offensive, it was clear that the Battle of the Bulge would not be decided quickly. American forces were bent but not broken, and holding them together against every physical and technological failure imaginable were radio operators fighting their own battle against cold, fear, and static. If they failed, the line would shatter completely. As the German offensive pressed deeper into the Ardennes, the battlefield fractured into isolated pockets of resistance. Snow continued to fall, roads disappeared under ice, and entire American units found themselves surrounded without clear knowledge of who was still fighting nearby. In this environment, the radio became more than a tool of command. It became the difference between coordinated resistance and total annihilation. Radio operators now worked under constant pressure. The initial shock of the German breakthrough had passed, but what followed was worse. Units were ordered to hold positions that could not be reinforced. Ammunition ran low. Medical evacuation became impossible. Food froze solid, and yet orders continued to arrive through crackling headsets, often delayed, incomplete, or distorted by interference. In many locations, wire communications had already been destroyed. German patrols deliberately cut telephone lines and targeted switchboards. This left radio operators as the sole remaining link to higher command. Once a radio went silent, a unit effectively vanished from the battlefield. German forces quickly adapted. They learned to listen for transmissions, triangulate signals, and target command posts. Antennas drew fire. Operators reported incoming shells within seconds of beginning a transmission. Some units attempted to relocate radios constantly, transmitting briefly before moving again to avoid detection. Others had no such luxury and transmitted knowing it might be their last act. Nowhere was this more evident than in the defense of Bastogne. By December 20th, Bastogne was completely surrounded. German forces controlled the high ground and road network. American units inside the perimeter were a patchwork of airborne troops, armor, artillery, and support units thrown together under extreme pressure. Supplies were critically low and casualties mounted. Inside the encirclement, radio operators worked nonstop. Frequencies were crowded, interference was severe, multiple units attempted to transmit simultaneously, creating confusion and overlap. Operators had to maintain discipline under fire, waiting for clear moments to push messages through. Artillery coordination depended entirely on radio traffic. Observers relayed enemy movements and requested fire missions, while German infantry probed defensive lines. Without these transmissions, American artillery would have been blind, unable to bring devastating firepower to bear against German armor and troop concentrations. Outside Bastogne, radio operators were equally critical. Units attempting to break through the encirclement relied on radio contact to coordinate movements, avoid friendly fire, and adjust plans as German resistance shifted. When contact failed, attack stalled or turned deadly. The psychological toll on radio operators was immense. Many were awake for days at a time. Sleep came in minutes, not hours. Headsets remained on even while resting, as messages could arrive at any moment. Operators knew that missing a transmission could cost lives. This constant vigilance wore down even the most disciplined soldiers. Cold injuries became common. Fingers stiffened until they could barely adjust dials or tap keys. Operators lost a sensation in their hands, forcing them to manipulate equipment through pain or numbness. Frostbite cases mounted, yet many refused evacuation, knowing that losing a trained operator could cripple a unit's communication. Some operators continued transmitting while wounded. Shrapnel injuries, concussions, and burns did not always stop transmissions. Reports exist of operators propping radios against walls or trees, using one functional hand to transmit while bleeding in the snow. These were not acts of heroism performed for recognition. They were acts of necessity. Across the Ardennes, surrounded units sent increasingly desperate messages. Requests for ammunition resupply. Reports of tanks advancing through forest roads. Calls for artillery strikes dangerously close to friendly positions. Confirmation that wounded could not be moved. Some messages ended abruptly, cut off mid-sentence as radios were destroyed or operators killed. In the northern sector, American units trapped near towns and road junctions relied entirely on radio contact to coordinate withdrawals and defensive stands. Commanders often made decisions based on partial information, trusting radio operators to relay what little could be seen through snow and fog. In several cases, timely radio warnings allowed units to avoid encirclement or escape under cover of darkness. The German offensive depended on speed. Every delay weakened it. Radio operators played a direct role in slowing the attack. By keeping artillery coordinated, reinforcements informed, and defensive lines coherent, they denied the Germans the rapid collapse they needed for victory. Inside Bastogne, the situation remained dire. Weather continued to ground Allied aircraft. Supplies dwindled further. German demands for surrender were received and rejected. Throughout it all, radio operators kept transmitting, maintaining contact with Corps headquarters, and coordinating what defenses could still be mounted. By late December, the Battle of the Bulge had reached its most critical phase. American forces were stretched thin, exhausted, and freezing. German forces pressed hard, knowing time was running out. The outcome depended not only on tanks and infantry, but on whether isolated defenders could remain connected long enough for relief to arrive. Through constant static, enemy fire, and failing equipment, radio operators held the line, and soon the battlefield would begin to change. In the final days of December 1944, the battle in the Ardennes began to shift. After weeks of relentless snow and fog, the weather finally broke. Clear skies opened above the frozen forests, and with them came Allied aircraft. For the first time since the German offensive began, American forces could fully coordinate air support, resupply, and large-scale counterattacks. At the center of this transition were the same men who had fought the battle through static, radio operators. As skies cleared, radio traffic surged. Aircraft needed ground coordination. Supply drops had to be guided to precise locations. Artillery fire had to be adjusted rapidly as German units attempted to reposition. Radio operators became the bridge between isolated defenders and the full weight of Allied power. Inside Bastogne, operators worked continuously to guide airdrops. Parachutes carrying ammunition, food, and medical supplies filled the sky. Radios allowed drop zones to be marked, corrected, and defended. Without accurate communication, supplies would have fallen into German hands or scattered uselessly across the snow. Radio operators also coordinated artillery support with newly available air reconnaissance. Enemy armor and troop movements, once hidden by fog, were now exposed. Observers relayed positions in real time, allowing American artillery to devastate German formations, attempting to reinforce or withdraw. The ability to react quickly depended entirely on uninterrupted communication. As relief forces advanced toward Bastogne, radio contact became critical to prevent confusion and friendly fire. Units moving through narrow forest roads relied on constant updates to avoid ambush and coordinate attacks. When contact was lost, advances stalled. When it held, momentum returned. On December 26, elements of Patton's Third Army reached Bastogne, breaking the encirclement. Radio operators on both sides of the perimeter transmitted confirmations that the link had been made. For the men inside the town, those transmissions marked the end of isolation and the beginning of survival. Elsewhere in the Ardennes, surrounded units were relieved or fought their way out as German momentum collapsed. The failure to silence American communications had cost the German offensive its speed and coordination. Delays multiplied, fuel shortages worsened, units became disorganized, the bulge in the Allied lines began to shrink. When the fighting finally subsided in January 1945, The Battle of the Bulge stood as the largest and bloodiest battle fought by American forces in World War II. Tens of thousands were killed, wounded, or captured. Towns were destroyed. Forests were shattered by artillery fire. Radio operators were rarely mentioned in headlines or after-action reports. They did not lead charges or command divisions, yet their impact was undeniable. Without their ability to maintain communication under the worst possible conditions, entire formations would have collapsed. Artillery would have fallen silent, relief efforts would have failed. The lessons learned in the Ardennes reshaped military communications. Radios were redesigned for cold weather performance. Battery technology improved. Training emphasized redundancy, mobility, and operator protection. Communication doctrine evolved to ensure that no unit would ever again be so vulnerable to isolation. For the men who carried radios through the snow, recognition often came quietly, if at all. Many returned home without medals or public acknowledgement. Some carried lifelong injuries from frostbite or shrapnel. Others carried memories of voices lost to static, messages cut short, and the weight of knowing how close everything came to collapse. Their legacy was not written in speeches or monuments. It was written in survival. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, when the enemy pressed hardest and technology failed at every turn, radio operators held the line. Through fear, cold, and constant interference, they kept the American army connected. They turned chaos into coordination, isolation into resistance, and static into survival. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed learning something new today, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment telling us what you thought of this story.